This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. The North Country National Scenic Trail is the longest trail in the United States. It stretches 4,600 miles from North Dakota to Vermont. From April to October of 2013, Luke Jordan thru-hiked the trail from west to east, encountering many obstacles, including knee-deep snow, tree blowdowns, and overgrown trails almost impossible to navigate. You can learn more about his adventure at striderNCT.com. Luke Jordan, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thank you.
Luke, tell me, what is the North Country Trail?
It's actually kind of complicated compared to what most people think it is. It's actually one of 11 trails that's been designated by Congress as a National Scenic Trail, and that's among others like the famous Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, and it's actually the longest of those. It's twice as long as the Appalachian Trail is. It's also, in my experience, I haven't hiked any of the other ones, but it's actually more diverse than most of the other ones too.
Have a lot of people thru-hiked this trail?
I was the fourth thru-hiker, and the trail's been around for about 30 years. And actually, this year we actually had two people. I finished in October, and then a month later, another guy finished a thru-hike also. So this year we had two. So there have been 5 thru-hikers total.
Why do you think it is that there's so few?
Part of it is it's so little known compared to the other trails. Most people, if they decide to do one thru-hike, they either do the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. And a lot of people do what's called the Triple Crown, which is those two, and then plus the Continental Divide Trail. And this trail has only been around since 1980, so it's very little known. And that was kind of what actually drew me to it, was just I wanted to kind of increase awareness of the trail. So I kind of made that a personal goal of mine. But that's probably the main reason, is that it's so little known that few people actually have the opportunity to get out there because they obviously haven't heard about it, which to me is really disappointing because it has a lot to offer.
What is it that got you interested in long-distance hiking?
You know, I've always been a camper, a hiker, ever since I was little. It kind of started out, my family would take annual trips up to Lake Superior, northern Minnesota, and we'd, stay at the state parks or whatever in the area. And so I've been hiking since I was little, just doing little day hikes. And I didn't really think about long-distance hiking until I took a trip out to Colorado one summer. And I was a volunteer on a Forest Service kind of historic preservation project. And it turns out that the job site was right on the Continental Divide Trail. And I happened to be one of the other volunteers there, happened to have this vast experience in backpacking. And he kind of shared some of his stories with me about, he had done the Appalachian Trail. He had spent a month over on kind of in some of the British Isles. He'd been to Ireland and Isle of Man, among others. And he just had these incredible stories. And I kind of got the spark going. And that was when I was 17. A couple of years later, I started college right after that. And so I got, my first backpack and took it out for some weekends, and eventually went for a week on Isle Royale and decided I was going to do the thru-hike, and just kind of jumped right into it.
How did you earn your trail name Strider?
Actually, I got it from a camping trip I took with my family in 2011. Actually, it was on that trip that I actually decided I was going to do the thru-hike, and how it came about was we were hiking along, and I tend to be a pretty fast hiker, and so my family told me to slow down because they couldn't keep up with my long strides. And at the time, I was looking for a trail name, so that kind of just clicked. And I was like, oh, Strider, that would be a name to work, and that kind of just stuck. And so that's what people know me as on the trail.
How long did it take for you to plan out this expedition?
It took me about a year and a half, kind of off and on, because I was still in college at the time, so I had to focus on schoolwork. So basically, any free time that I had, including like weekends, I spent just planned doing trail stuff. It involved mainly, I didn't really have to do any physical training because I had been a long-distance runner previously. I competed in both high school and college competitively, in cross-country and track and field. So I had kind of the physical part already down and the endurance. But most of the planning was doing the physical, finding where the trail went, finding, contact information for all the different people, getting the maps, stuff like that. So actually, and then also getting supplies that I didn't have yet. And the first thing I did was actually I made a list of all the towns that the trail went through, and then I got addresses for all the post offices, and that's what I ended up using to get my supplies while on the trail. And so a year and a half of just slowly piecing together, all of the individual pieces of information, and then eventually coming up with a timeline and then a start date, and figuring out what all my supply drops are going to be. And on top of that, not all the trail at this point is covered by maps. There's a couple of gaps that are all on roads, and don't publish those maps yet. So on top of that, I had to kind of make my own map to pick a route between the existing segments to walk on roads to connect the off-road sections of the trail that currently existed. So there was actually a lot goes into it, and that's actually the best, or the most important thing of planning a through hike, is make sure that it's well thought out and well planned.
How well did your planning turn out in terms of food, for example?
It worked out pretty well. I never ran out of food. The only problem was there's a few times where I went faster than I thought I would, so I had too much food. So I planned it pretty well. I didn't run into any major issues.
When you were piecing together your gear kit, did you give a lot of thought to the weight, and how much time did you spend exploring ultralight gear?
Weight wasn't a huge concern for me. I did keep it in mind. I tried to keep my pack around 30 pounds, which it ended up being most of the trip. I wasn't going to be an extremist by any means because I wanted to enjoy the trip as well. So I didn't want to pack with like the bare minimum to get by. So I had a couple luxuries. But yeah, for the most part, I just tried really hard to keep it, around 30, because I realized that through my test runs about, when I did, basically the year before, I did weekend trips just trying to, I put like 50 pounds in my pack and go out for the weekend and, kind of see how it felt. And I found that, over 35 pounds, it starts to get uncomfortable. So I wanted to make sure I was well below that. And so that was kind of my goal, just to stick to that. And for the most part, I was able to do that.
Do you have any fears going into this, Luke?
My biggest fear was actually not completing it. I was actually a little unsure of myself because I'd never done anything like this before. This was my first through hike ever. And I'd only done the one longer trip, which was a week on Isle Royale the year before. And that was kind of, training to test out. At that point, I had all my gear, so I kind of brought it up to test it out all at once in the field. I was a little bit unsure about making it, 6.5 months across a lot of the wilderness. I made a personal goal that I wasn't going to give up until I made it at least through Minnesota. So I have 2 states under my belt, because at that point I'd be over a fourth of the way through. But it ended up not being an issue for the most part. There were a couple times where I wanted to give up, but I made it through. And so really the only fear I had going into it was just not finishing, especially because I had announced that I was going to it, so there was all that extra pressure as well. So I feel like I would have been letting myself and a lot of other people down as well that were kind of, hoping and rooting for me to finish.
What were some of the techniques you used to keep yourself motivated?
I focused on the positive. I tried not to let, short-term setbacks get to me. So I was just kind of focusing on the big picture and knowing that in the end, things are eventually going to turn in my favor. Because it did get a little rough in the beginning because we had that horrible winter last year. And, going into the first week of May, there was still snow on the ground. So I was on snowshoes for the first 6 weeks. And that was the first time I actually started to doubt myself. I thought I might not finish, because I had anticipated being on snowshoes for about 2 weeks, but not 6. And they just got deeper the further east I went. That was probably one of the biggest hurdles, but I just kind of, again, focused on just told myself, okay, things will eventually turn in my favor. The snow's going to melt eventually, and I'll be okay. So that's kind of just trying to stay positive is the biggest thing.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the hike itself. Maybe you can take me through, I know it's a long trek, but maybe you can just talk about how did you get to the starting point, and then speak to sort of the big chunks of it, the pieces that you remember as being, what sticks in your mind, and maybe some of the big hurdles, and then take us through from start to finish.
Okay, yeah, I'll just give you a little summary. So I live in kind of just outside the suburbs of Minneapolis. So the trail starts in central North Dakota on Lake Sagagawea, which along I-94, it's about a 7-hour drive or so it's not that far really. And so basically, my mother had some vacation saved up at a place she works, so she took a week off to actually get me started, because actually at the beginning of the trail in North Dakota, there's nowhere to camp. So really, it's impossible to do that part without a support crew, unless you camp illegally, which I didn't want to do. I drove out on a Wednesday. I started March 27th, and so we drove out, and I just started hiking one day. So I got there about 3 o'clock, and I did 9 miles the first day, and then we stayed at hotels for, I think it was 10 days, and then she eventually went back home, and I just kept hiking on my own after that. And so all of North Dakota was basically snow-covered, and a lot of people think it's just, wheat fields and telephone poles, but North Dakota actually has a lot to offer. Unfortunately, I missed some of that because everything was covered under, it was a frozen tundra at the time, so I didn't get to see a lot of what it could have been. But I actually enjoyed North Dakota quite a bit, despite it being really cold and needing the snowshoes all the time. One of the jewels there is actually the Cheyenne Grasslands, it's a Forest Service unit, and there's about 27 miles of trail there. That's probably the most traveled one. That section actually allows horses as well. In the fall, it would make a really great hike, and I was actually planning on going back and hiking that after I finished, but I ended up finishing too late in the year. It was already cold when I got here again. So North Dakota was, in the long run, pretty uneventful, except for there were 3 pretty big snowstorms that came through, so I had to get shelter from those, but luckily I was near town at the time, so I just kind of holed up in a motel for the night and just kind of waited for it to go through. So the trail then crosses into Minnesota, just a little bit southwest of Pelican Rapids, near Fort Abercrombie, and which is actually right on the Red River. And there was actually, it was definitely going to flood for sure, I knew, because all the snow we had, but luckily I beat the flood stage because it hadn't started to melt quickly yet. So luckily that wasn't an issue, because otherwise I would have been trapped and would have had to get a ride around somewhere. And then kind of the first, what we call certified trail in Minnesota, actually is a little bit north of Frazee. A new section was built last year through Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge, and so that's kind of where the trail in Minnesota starts. And from there you can hike 160 miles on completely hikeable off-road trail all the way to Reamer. And that goes through Itasca State Park and the Chippewa National Forest. Again, it would be a gorgeous hike later in the year, but I was just so sick of the snow at that point, I kind of lost some of the enjoyment out of it. And also on that stretch, water actually became a problem because all the lakes were frozen. So, finding water and staying hydrated actually became a big problem because it was actually still cold, and the snow, I tried to melt snow and it wouldn't melt fast enough to get enough water. So that was a real issue, but luckily some people that were following my hike heard about that, so they would actually leave me care packages at trailheads that had water bottles in them. So luckily I was able to stay hydrated that way. Shortly after that, though, the snow actually did melt. We had a couple of days where it hit 70 degrees, so the snow melted pretty quickly. And so after the off-road trail kind of ends in Minnesota, there's this thing going on right now. They're actually working on rerouting the original route of the trail in Minnesota, and it's this legislation known as the Arrowhead Reroute. And basically, the original route went from Reamer to straight across to Jay Cook State Park, and it turns out that most of that land is all swampland. So nobody's really wanted to, build that trail because it would take tons of money to do and lots of maintenance. And they estimated they would need about 40 miles of boardwalk because it's just so wet there. And in the meantime, though, since the trail was created in 1980, the Superior Hiking Trail had been in formation, and every year they got, lots more miles of trail on the ground. So they decided they were going to reroute the trail through some already existing trails through the Arrowhead region. But unfortunately, because it's a national trail, it's kind of like you're moving into national park, so Congress has to approve it. And so they've been trying since 2004 to get that to go through, and as of yet, they haven't had any luck. But hikers are basically required to do the reroute. So from basically Grand Rapids, I followed the paved Masabi Trail, which is a bike trail in the summertime, all the way to Ely. And then from there, I took the Kekakavik and the Border Route trails across the Boundary Waters. And then from the Border Route trail on the eastern end ends at the northern terminus of the Superior Hiking Trail. And so I followed that all the way down to Jay Cook and across into Wisconsin. And for me, that was one of the highlights. The first long hike I did was on what we call the SHT, the abbreviation for it. And my family actually has a cabin very near the trail. It crosses the road about 400 feet from where my cabin is. And so, again, it was Memorial Day weekend when I was in that area. So my whole family came up for a couple of days. And I was able to, what we call flat pack, which basically I was given a day pack for a couple of days, and I was able just to hike more miles with lighter weight load. And I just days camped out of the cabin. And that's really nice. And actually, this been a goal of mine. We got the cabin in 2003, and I was 13 at the time. And my goal was to hike that whole trail by the time I graduated college. And then I found out about the North Country Trail, which includes now the Superior Hiking Trail. So it was kind of nice to finally achieve that goal amongst this goal as well. So that was by far one of the highlights. And on top of that, I had a couple friends who came to hike with me, and that made it a lot more enjoyable. And the snow was finally gone, so I saw the first buds come out, and by the time I reached the loop, everything was fully reached out in that 2-week period. After that, I crossed into Wisconsin, and the bugs came out right away. I would go every day peeling about 50 ticks off of me, half deer ticks, half wood ticks, so it didn't really freak me out until that being in Minnesota and everything. And actually, Wisconsin is really short. There's only about 200 miles of trail, so I was through that in about 10 days. The started to come out, it went right from winter into summer because it was already, 75 degrees, pretty humid. And in Wisconsin, I actually had my first, what I would call a negative encounter with wildlife. The first day, I was attacked by a goshawk, which is basically, people that don't know, it's basically a raptor bird. It kind of reminded me of a peregrine falcon, probably a little bit smaller though. And basically, I think I got too close to its nest, even though I was still on the trail. So it actually came at me 8 different times. It kind of swooped around and circled around. But luckily, I escaped unscathed.
Well,
and
how close did it get to you?
Pretty close. Actually, the first time I didn't notice it until it was right on me, and I ducked, and I could feel the wind from its wings on the back of my neck. It was really close. And then my last day in Wisconsin, I actually had my first encounter with a black bear, which was a 600-pound male that kind of came upon suddenly. So I was only about 30 feet away from it. And so I panicked for a split second, and then I calmed down, and eventually it saw me, and it just kind of wandered off. I just made myself look really big. And so there's no problems there. And then from there, the trail in Michigan has the most miles of trail. There's about 1,200 miles, and because it traverses across the upper and the lower peninsula both. Michigan, starting out, was really great. It goes through the Porcupine Mountains, which is actually very similar to northern Minnesota, where we have the sawtooths here. And there's lots of gorgeous, river gorges and waterfalls and all that kind of stuff. But also in Michigan is where I hit probably the worst roadblock as far as my mental capacity was concerned. The mosquitoes this year were so bad because of all the snow melt, there was standing water everywhere. So all the eggs that had been dormant for several years all came out at once. Even I heard from some of the locals there that it was the worst they'd ever seen. So it was just the number of mosquitoes, and I'm from Minnesota, so I'm used to that, but they were by far probably 3 times worse than I've ever seen. And so having to do that day after day after day, it messes with your head.
Luke, what are you doing for, mosquito repellent?
I had, DEET bug spray, and I also had, the bug net and long sleeves, long pants, but it really didn't help because there's so many of them. And on top of just being bit, that constant buzzing, it just drives you crazy. And for me, so the entire Upper Peninsula, I had to wear, bug stuff every day. And so that was almost a month. So it was just absolutely dreadful for the most part. Until I got close to Lake Superior again, then the breeze kind of kept them away for a couple days. But it was, I definitely thought about giving up just because of that, because it was just so unbearable. But somehow I ended up making through, and I came out on the other side. As soon as I reached the Lower Peninsula, they kind of just suddenly disappeared, which was really kind of surprising. But I was glad because I was able to enjoy the hike a lot more after that. My whole hike, I kind of take 3 highlights of the whole trip. So the first one was both the border route and the Superior hiking trail back-to-back with the first one. And then the second one was actually Patriot Rocks, which is in the Upper Peninsula, and which I had been there before just for a day. It's absolutely gorgeous. There's 42 miles of trail right along the bluffs of Lake Superior. There's these really cool rock formations, and it's really sandy soil, so it's pretty diverse as well, because most of the lake has, the rocky outcrops and kind of the exposed bedrock, but this area is totally different and very unique. So that was kind of the second highlight of the entire trip. And then from there, to get to the Lower Peninsula, I had to cross the Mackinac Bridge, which is kind of a sticky issue with me, because actually as of last year, they came out with a policy that announced that all through hikers have to hike the bridge, and it's only open on Labor Day for pedestrians. So that makes it really challenging and darn near impossible, especially for, a typical through hiker doesn't have the money to, travel from wherever he is to go to Michigan on the one day it's open. So I actually ended up doing it last year. I made a long weekend out of it for Labor Day weekend. I actually ended up just doing the bridge and then doing the rest of the trail this year. And so I hope they change that soon, because I can tell the people that are in charge of it that it's going to turn through hikers away, because I was definitely disappointed when I found out I had to do it. And it doesn't make any sense, because the bridge is an interstate freeway. It can never be a certified trail, so there's no reason to make people hike it. And the fact that it's so inconvenient, because it's only open the one day a year. So in order for me to have to do it this year, I was in Pennsylvania at the time, I would have had to get somehow transportation from Pennsylvania to Michigan for a day and then back. And that's a huge, it wastes 2 days on the trail, and on top of that, it's a big financial expense. So it really makes no sense why they require that. So I paid, the Bridge Authority has a little kiosk there, so you pay them $3 and they can shuttle you across. And so I did that, and then Lower Peninsula is actually pretty diverse. You start out, you're still in the North Woods. You go through the Manistee National Forest along the Manistee National River, and that area is also really sandy soil. And there's actually one pretty unique area that there's actually prickly pear cacti growing because it's so dry there for some reason, which I assume is why there weren't many mosquitoes. So that was kind of a very unexpected but very welcome little burst of diversity. And soon after that, and that's the trail's halfway point near Lowell, Michigan. And from that point, it's about 1,000 miles of trail through just, kind of the rural countryside, through farm communities and kind of rolling hill country. So after that, through the rest of Michigan and Ohio, for the most part, it was all going through farm country. Ohio was my least favorite. I had the most negative experiences there, most of it being because the trail there was not well marked and maintained, so I had to fight with, brush and brambles most of the time, and the heat too, because the trail, for some reason, it circles the whole state of Ohio, so it actually goes near the Kentucky border for a while, so you're pretty far south. And so in August, which is when I was there, I was at it was, pushing 100 degrees all the time, and I had two pretty bad heat waves that they took a lot out of me, because walking in the heat with no relief, it drains your energy so quickly. And there was one in particular where it was 10 days in a row where it was pushing 100 degrees, and I had no relief. I was on a stretch of trail where there was no towns, no anything, and I'm sleeping in a tent most of the time, so I had no way to really get relief from the heat. So by the end of day 6, I was starting to get kind of confused, so it was starting to affect me. I was getting really bad heat exhaustion. And that was probably one of the more dangerous times of my trip. I could have had serious health effects from that. But I ended up getting relief the next day. I stayed at a little bed and breakfast, and then the next 2 days after that, I got a little bit of trail magic, where I stayed at a woman's house for 2 nights and was able to, base camp out of there, and so stay cool at night. And so Ohio overall, that's just a couple examples, but Ohio overall was a negative experience. But that's been kind of, the whole hike in general was positive, so I'm able to kind of overlook that. Pennsylvania had probably the most well-marked and well-maintained trail of any state on the trail. And also, it reminded me of Minnesota. There's a lot of, glacial activity there, lots of, exposed bedrock, glacial erratics, things like that. So Pennsylvania was a real treat, especially after coming out of Ohio. I was so happy to finally reach Pennsylvania and be back in the North Woods again. But the best state overall, as far as scenery goes, had to be New York. In New York, the trail follows the already existing Finger Lakes Trail for about 420 miles or so. One of the highlights there was this place called Watkins Glen, which is, coming from Minnesota, we have a lot of, civilian conservation corps history here. Well, New York has the same amount, but there's this one place in particular called Watkins Glen, where it's basically a 3-mile long stretch of river where it goes through this big canyon. And basically what the Conservation Corps did is they carved stairs in the side of the rock. And so there's a 3-mile section of trail that you just go through this cathedral of all this CCC history, going over, even tunnels that they've kind of dug into the rock, and stairways, and also bridges. And there's tons of waterfalls, and it's just an absolutely incredible place. So I was so happy to finally reach that. After that, I was on the final stretch. That's about halfway through New York. So at this point, I had about 300 miles to go, and I finally reached Adirondack Park, which is a huge wilderness area. It's 4 times the size of Yellowstone, but it's owned by the state. And there's 5,000-foot peaks there. It goes through. As of right now, there's no official trail there because they're trying to stay away from this region known as the High Peaks, which is a really sensitive area, but it also gets lots of foot traffic, so they're worried about overusage. But being as there is no route yet, I was able to kind of choose my own route. And the past 2 thru-hikers that came before me went through this region, so I decided to kind of follow in their footsteps. And they actually brought me over Mount Marcy, which is New York's highest peak. And that was the third highlight of the entire trip, was going through the Adirondacks. It was absolutely breathtaking scenery. And actually from the top of Mount Marcy, I could see Lake Champlain, which is where the trail ends. It was 40 miles away. That was so high up that I could see it. And so I got a boost of energy knowing that tomorrow I'm going to finish the trail. And it was a very kind of emotional moment. And then so the next day, I arrived at Crown Point, which is basically an old British fort on the shores of Lake Champlain, and I was done. That was October 13th. And actually, my hike wasn't over yet because, A, I had to get home, and Crown Point's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And they're actually, the original plan for the North Country Trail was to actually extend it through Vermont to the Appalachian Trail. But at the time, the Green Mountain Club was worried about overusage again, so they wouldn't allow it to. So the trail was forced to terminate at New York. But now it's been a generation later, so they've actually changed their minds. So now they actually just finished the final plan, the final paperwork to make the extension part of the trail. So I actually took 4 extra days to hike to the Appalachian Trail. So 4 days later, I arrived at this place called Main Junction, which if you're northbound on the Appalachian Trail, it's where the Long Trail and the Appalachian Trail diverge, where the Appalachian Trail, you'll take a right, and then it'll take you to Maine. And if you go straight, you'll stay on the Long Trail and go to Canada. So that's actually, my hike officially ended there. And then from there, it was a mile hike on the AT to the next road, and I got to ride into Rutland, Vermont, where I boarded a train to get home. And so that was kind of the basic summary of my hike. But it was overall, it was a positive experience, and I would definitely do it again. And I would definitely encourage anybody who's thinking about doing some kind of thru hike to not overlook the North Country Trail, because it is very diverse, and I think it has the potential to be the crown jewel of the entire national trail system.
Well, very, very cool. Congratulations on the accomplishment.
Oh, thanks.
Luke, how did you navigate?
The North Country Trail publishes their own maps. So I had those, and on top of that, because I was thru hiker, I actually reached out to them before I started, and they actually ended up sponsoring me. So they actually loaned me a GPS unit to use, and with that, they gave me a specialized set of maps that had GPS waypoints on them. So if I got lost, there was a waypoint every mile. I could find out where I was. I didn't have to use it a lot, but when I did need it, it was really handy. For the most part, though, the trail is really well marked, except for those few places in Ohio. There's one in Michigan that was pretty bad, but for the most part, the trail is really easy to follow. It's marked by blue blazes on the trees, and there's usually one always inside you, so you can see it. So it's pretty hard to get lost, for the most part. So I really didn't have many problems with navigating. The only part where it was tough is that there hadn't been any maintenance recently, or on the parts where it just wasn't marked, and so it was kind of a bushwhack. But, yeah, for the most part, it wasn't a problem.
Luke, you mentioned earlier the term certified trail. What does that mean?
That basically means that it meets the standards for the National Park Service, and they're actually the ones who administer the trail. So the trail is basically a long, skinny national park. So when we mean certified, it means that section has basically been designated as part of the National Scenic Trail. And then with that, it's able to bear the official emblem. All the National Scenic Trails kind of have the same shape, but the kind of design in the middle varies. And for the North Country Trail, it's actually a blue background, and it has the North Star on it. And so once it gets certified, the trail assignment can then use that official logo at trailheads and road crossings and such.
How important were the trail angels to your success?
Very important. It would have been a lot harder without them. On top of providing, services, like a lot of the people I met would give, they'd buy me a meal if I saw them at a bar or a restaurant. They take me to their homes during a storm or just otherwise, just to get, time off of the ground, not living in a tent. I had one guy, I actually came home for a wedding in August for a couple of days. I had one guy that drove like 100 miles to pick me up and bring me to the airport, which is just great. So I had lots of, kind of over-the-top generosity like that. Even just like little things can go a long way as far as boosting your morale and, kind of keeping a positive attitude. So the trail angels are very important. My hike definitely would have been a lot harder if I didn't have that help I had.
How do these trail angels find out about what you're doing? Are you doing a lot of your own social media work to announce what you're doing, or is there some kind of just underground, communication network that people just somehow find out about these thru hikers?
It's kind of a combination of things. I started out, I actually made a website for the hike. I intended to keep up regular journal entries, which in the beginning I was doing good with. But then by the time I reached Michigan, it was, the days are longer. It was, it didn't get dark till like 9:30 at night, so I was doing longer days. And so by the end of the day, I was just too tired to write, so I fell really far behind on the journals. So I decided just to stop writing, just focus on the hike, so I ended up just taking good notes at the end of the day, because I actually do plan on writing a book eventually about it. And so when I actually go back to write it, that information will come fresh with the notes. But in the meantime, from the North Country Trail Association sponsored me, so they did like a social media campaign, because their goal was the same as mine. They wanted to increase awareness on the trail and get more people out using it. So they kind of used me to do that. So they would, on their Facebook page, they would post, Strider sighting. And so they would say, they'd have an update at least once a week, if not, twice or three times, by somebody who had seen me, or, they would hear from me and just kind of post my locations, so people that are interested would know roughly when I'd be in their area, and they'd be able to kind of, wait for me or track me down wherever I was. So social media played a pretty big part in people being able to find out where I was.
What does someone that might want to follow in your footsteps, what do they need to know, and what do they need to prepare in terms of a budget?
I planned about $5,000, which I didn't use even close to that. But I took into account having the luxuries of one motel and one restaurant meal per week, and that would allow me about $180 to spend per week. Because I did take into account the normal expenses, you're gonna have to do post office fees to send stuff home and stuff like that. But I wanted to have a more enjoyable hike, so I tried to make it have more luxuries like motels, because most hikers won't stay in motels because they want to save as much money as possible. But so with that $5,000 budget, I planned for those kind of things, and I ended up not spending. It's easy. You can do it on probably $2,500, $3,000, maybe even less if you plan on not staying in motels and eating at restaurants. But it definitely makes a more enjoyable hike. And actually, on top of that, a lot of the trail angels I had, they actually took away some of my costs because I would get a free meal at their house. I didn't have to buy something, or lodging either, because I was just in their house. So that also, the trail angels also help with that. They relieve some of the financial toll as well.
If you had to do this all over again, what's one thing you would do different?
I'm not sure. I mean, I planned my hike pretty well, so there was very few issues with that. If I did the same trail again, I'd probably start in the middle somewhere and hike one direction and then come back and hike the other direction. Because with the way I started, the North Country Trail is hard because it's a linear trail that goes east to west, and you're in the north, so you're almost guaranteed to encounter winter on at least one end. So I would probably avoid winter altogether and start somewhere in the south, and then kind of leapfrog it. And if I was doing another trail, I would just base my planning on the experience I've already had and just kind of go from there. But as far as what I do differently, I really don't know. I mean, I did everything probably as well as I could have, being a rookie going into it. So I really wouldn't change anything as far as, what I planned it went.
Do you have any advice for the next thru hike around the North Country Trail?
Yeah, I would just say that, planning is the most important thing. This isn't one of those things where you can just jump in and, do okay. It takes lots of planning, especially because, some people on the Appalachian Trail, they can do that because it's so well hiked and so well documented that it's easy to find stuff on there. And again, I haven't hiked it, so I don't have anything to base this off of. I just know what I've heard. But the North Country Trail, because I was the fourth person in 30 years to do it, there is no documentation to help hikers out about that kind of stuff. So you have to do it all yourself. And so planning is definitely the most important thing. I'd say if you don't spend a year, you're probably not ready. If you don't spend a year planning, figuring everything out, because that's how long it took me kind of in those spurts.
Luke, what's next for you?
Hike-wise, I don't know. I'll just kind of jump on that horse whenever it comes. But right now I'm actually hoping to start my career pretty soon. I applied for a couple jobs. They're kind of just, minimum wage starting positions, but it's a place to get my foot in the door. So I'm just hoping to, end up somewhere working for a trail agency, hopefully the North Country Trail someday. Yeah, so right now I'm just hoping, and I have a degree in natural resources, so this hiking stuff kind of applies. So I'm just kind of hoping to end up somewhere where I can make a positive difference in the trail community.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more about your hike?
My website is there. They can leave me my email address is there as well, but if they want to actually get in touch with me, they can email me at stridernct@gmail.com.
Okay, Luke Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling your story. I really appreciate it. And
no problem. Happy to do it.
Good luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Recorded December 10, 2013. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.